I don't know if you've heard about this, but we have a crisis on our border. Not the Canadian border, but the other one. And I know about the crisis on the border because every time I open paper, by which I mean every time I open my Twitter feed, I read that there is a crisis on the border. CNN says there's a crisis on the border. The New York Times says there's a crisis on the border. Fox News says there's a crisis on the border, and it's Obama's fault. So what is this crisis at the border that I can't stop hearing about? Well, since October 2013, more than 57,000 unaccompanied minor children have been arrested by Border Patrol agents while crossing from Mexico and Central America into Texas, mostly in the Rio Grande Valley. Arrested makes it sound more adversarial than it actually is. Unlike in the border crossings of the 1990s and the early 2000s, when immigrants, primarily from Mexico and primarily in search of work, were playing a sort of cat and mouse game with border agents, these children are happy to get arrested. They look for Border Patrol agents and they walk right up to them. Arrest me, please. There are other differences between these young border crossers and what we usually think of when we think of immigrants crossing the southern border. These children are not primarily from Mexico, and they are not primarily looking for work. According to the New York Times, more than 3/4 of these children are from mostly poor and violent towns in 3 countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Children from Mexico, once the largest group, make up less than 1/4 of these children. And while their reasons for coming to the U.S. are varied, they are much more often seeking safety than work. Their parents have sent them on a perilous journey to the U.S. because the alternative, staying in the crime and gang-ridden capitals of countries dominated by the violence of the drug trade, the alternative is far riskier. For example, Honduras, the second largest city, San Pedro Sula, is the murder capital of the world. Young boys, as they turn into young men, are often faced with the choice of joining a violent criminal gang or being murdered for their refusal. Young girls, as they turn into young women, become the targets of sexual violence. Many of these children crossing our borders are essentially refugees. But that is not the crisis. And just to be clear, the crisis is not that 57,000 children have lives so racked by poverty and violence that a desperate, dangerous, uncertain journey guided by criminal smugglers across thousands of miles is their best option. The crisis is that that journey has landed them here, in our neighborhood, and now we have to deal with it. Okay? It's not their life crisis, it's our refugee crisis. So in America, I guess, we call 57,000 refugees a crisis. A country like Jordan calls that not bad for a Tuesday. There are 420,000 official Syrian refugees in the country of Jordan, probably another 200,000 unofficial refugees, to join something like 700,000 Iraqi refugees in Jordan, a country with a population of 6.5 million, about the same size as Indiana. The United States has a population, by comparison, of about 318 million people. There are 500,000 displaced people in Haiti due to the earthquake. 500,000 people made homeless overnight in one shocking tragedy, versus our border crisis of 57,000 people arriving in a steady, predictable flow over the course of 8 months. Haiti has a GDP of about $13 billion. We have a GDP of $17 trillion. That's about 1,000 times larger. So to use a little business speak, if you will permit me, 57,000 child refugees for a country with 320 million people and $17 trillion does not sound like a crisis to me. It sounds like an opportunity. An opportunity to respond to this human need unexpectedly appearing on our borders with all the love and compassion and resources that this country can muster. This country that we are known to modestly refer to as the greatest nation on earth. Sometimes, maybe in all of human history, we're not sure. This is an opportunity for us. Now, some of my fellow Americans disagree. Again, quoted from the New York Times. That's my tax money taking care of a foreign national, or however you want to classify them, said Mr. Griffith, 51, a volunteer fireman and researcher at a chemical plant. I don't want to take care of a foreign national. It's not my problem. I sort of feel like we should be taking care of our own first. The refugee children, once they voluntarily surrender themselves to the Border Patrol, arrest me please, are given a health screening and immunizations. Their immigration case begins to wind its way through the courts, and while that's happening, eventually 85% of them will be placed with a parent or other close relative who is vetted for safety. But before they're placed, before a relative can be identified and vetted, they stay in temporary shelters. And on average, these children stay in a shelter for about 35 days. Now, with the increase in the number of children, there are not enough shelters, so new shelters need to be built in new places. I see this as an opportunity for all 50 of our great states to demonstrate that we are just as capable of practicing loving hospitality as any of those southern border states. Thank you very much. Some of my fellow Americans disagree. Again, from the New York Times. Protesters who marched against a proposed shelter in Vassar, Michigan, were armed with semi-automatic rifles and handguns. In Virginia, an effort to house the children at the shuttered campus of St. Paul's College in Lawrenceville caused such an uproar that federal officials pulled out, even though they'd already signed the lease. Someone spray-painted anti-immigrant graffiti on a brick wall at a former Army Reserve facility that was a potential shelter site. League City passed a resolution opposing any shelters from opening, even though the federal government had no plans to do so, getting ahead of the curve there. The resolution claimed that, quote, illegal aliens suffering from diseases endemic in their countries of origin are being released into our communities. And then on Monday, U.S. Representative Todd Rokita, Republican Indiana. How I love it when Indiana makes the national news. Representative Todd Rokita suggested Central American refugee children might spread Ebola. Ebola. So for the record, none of the 245 Central American children placed in Indiana homes being from Central America, none of the children had Ebola. You can sleep safe. The Northwest Indiana Times also reported that Representative Rokita, who is full of concerns these days, added that if more children are released into Hoosier relatives, they'll soon enroll in school, and ultimately your property taxes are going to go up. So for the record, Indiana schools are not funded by local property taxes and haven't been since 2009, so you can sleep safe. So there is a crisis here, I would say, but the crisis is nationwide, not on our borders, and the crisis is what's going on in this country's heart. All of our spiritual leaders, said Sister Simone Campbell in June, all of our spiritual leaders, when there are broken hearts or pain in the world, they have walked towards it. They walk towards the pain in order to embrace, touch, heal. Fox News contributor Laura Abraham in July. The first thing you do is start deporting people, not by the hundreds, not by the dozens, by the thousands. That means entire families, not just the father or mother. The first thing you do is start deporting people. Now, actually, most of these children cannot be deported. And the reason that they cannot be deported is a law that was passed in 2008 by President George W. Bush, passed with wide bipartisan support, that promises asylum to immigrant children that could demonstrate that they are fleeing from violence and that they could be subject to violence if they are deported back to their home country. So the children are required to be given an asylum hearing, which is why they're placed with families while that hearing is underway. This is a lengthy process. Okay? It was a lengthy process when about 6,000 kids came over the border every year. It's a longer process now that 57,000 kids are coming across the border. So the children wait. And this process, which again was put in place in 2008, has allegedly created a misconception in Central America that if children can just get to the border, they will be allowed to stay. And this misconception was supposedly aggravated by an executive order of President Obama in 2012 that did allow some undocumented workers to stay. The subtleties of U.S. immigration law are not always well understood by desperate parents 1,000 miles away. Mabel Ramos, 38, said she left a decent job as a social worker in El Salvador to get her 11-year-old daughter, Catherine, away from the gangs in her neighborhood. The gangs came to my house, Catherine said. They told my mother, take care of your daughter, her body is becoming so pretty. Her mother added, if you don't do what they say, these boys will kill you. I was ready to leave everything behind to protect the life of my child. Vivi Mejia, 27, who came from Honduras with 2 sons, 5 and 7, said she heard the rumor about being allowed to stay, and then she fled after a narcotics gang killed a cousin living alone. So this is why children are running straight to Border Patrol agents, because they think they will be allowed to stay. They think that they will be granted asylum. The far-right solution to their misconception that they will definitely be allowed to stay is to repeal the 2008 law and stop giving asylum to children. Simple. The Obama administration solution is to fast-track the asylum hearings, identify as quickly as we can those children who can be deported and deport them, to get the word across that you are not guaranteed a stay. This solution is just as problematic as the far-right get rid of the law solution, because it was a struggle to provide legal counsel to these kids when there were 6,000 of them. It is even more of a struggle to provide legal counsel now that there are 57,000 of them. And when you start racing these children through the process, the system falls apart. And that means that children being erased through the process could essentially end up facing a deportation hearing on their own, forcing them, as the ACLU noted, to defend themselves against a trained prosecutor on their own, with their lives literally on the line. So, as the Congress and the President debate the best way to turn back the tide, such as it is, of children fleeing bullets, and as our local politicians and our heavily armed civic groups discuss the imminent dangers posed by El Salvadoran kindergartners in local shelters, a new voice has entered the conversation. And it has entered it with urgency and clarity, and it is the voice of America's religious communities, for once, speaking with surprising unanimity. We're talking about whether we're going to stand at the border and tell children who are fleeing a burning building to go back inside, said Rabbi Asher Knight of the Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, quoted in the New York Times. The president of the Ethics Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, saying, quote, the anger directed towards vulnerable children is deplorable and disgusting. The first thing is to make sure we understand these are not issues, these are persons. These children are made in the image of God, and we ought to respond to them with compassion, not with fear. Southern Baptist Convention. In July, a coalition of evangelical organizations sent a letter to Congress opposing these proposals to expedite deportations. A similar letter is being prepared by the Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, the United Church of Christ, and yes, the Unitarian Universalist Association. The Catholic Church also opposes any effort to make it easier to deport children. 20 national Jewish groups issued their own statement. Now, some of these groups make unfamiliar bedfellows for Unitarian Universalists, to put it mildly. Most of them would not recognize UUs who identify as Christian as belonging to the Christian community. Some of them within their own theological framework might well have concern for the fate of our immortal souls, whereas some of us, within our own theological framework, don't believe in immortal souls. So we're coming from very different places. But when we are at our best, we all share a bedrock commitment to what, in our language, we call the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Other religious communities may not share our understanding of how that principle could apply to issues like marriage equality for LGBT people, or the ordination of women, or access to contraception and sex education. Right? Our disagreements are in many cases deep and substantive. These are not trivial issues. And so there may be a desire to sort of push away from the interfaith table. Or we may approach that table with stereotyped views of what we're going to find when we sit down. Stereotyped views of these other religious people. Our minds already made up about what they might be like, expecting to find intolerance or narrowness or racism or sexism or bigotry or condemnation. This year's 2014 Ware Lecture at General Assembly was given by Sister Simone Campbell. If you're not familiar with her, Sister Campbell is a Roman Catholic nun who famously led what was called the Nuns on the Bus Tour, where the sisters got chartered their own special bus and they went all around the country speaking out on social justice issues. And Sister Simone Campbell, in her Ware Lecture, she exhorts us, as she says, to walk towards danger, which means to engage with the critical issues in life, to find the points of pain and conflict in our world and walk towards them instead of away from them. And she says to do that, we need to walk willing with holy doubt. That means to resist the temptation to righteousness and the belief that we know what is in other people's hearts, and instead be open to hear others' viewpoints and to be surprised by what we find there. I take that also to mean we ought to be open to strange bedfellows. We don't always have to walk alone, even if we know that ultimately our path is going to diverge somewhere in the future. And of course, we can't influence a broader interfaith conversation if we're only talking amongst ourselves. So on July 31st, a coalition of 112 religious leaders, ordained and lay, representing many different denominations, gathered together in front of the White House to protest U.S. immigration policy. They got themselves arrested in the process. 31 of the 112 were Unitarian Universalists. They were processed and released the same day. No UUs were harmed in the making of this social picture. And among the arrested was the Reverend Catherine McTeague, the director of the UU College of Social Justice, and before that, a 25-year parish minister. And speaking at the protest, because Reverend McTeague was engaged in this interfaith work, she not only had the opportunity to be a larger voice for our values, but she had the opportunity to give a UU perspective on what grounds this kind of social justice work from our perspective. She said, our ancestors rejected the idea that God has a hell waiting for us after death. Instead, they pointed to all of the ways we human beings create hell for each other right here on earth. Their faith called them to do something about that very real and very present hell. And our faith is calling out to us still. And that's why we are here, she continues, as Unitarian Universalists. We see the hell of hopelessness that's been created for immigrants who are lost in detention. We see the suffering and the deaths caused by turning our borders into military zones. And we see the desperation that drives tens of thousands of children to flee their homes with nothing but a little sliver of hope that they might find safety here. She concludes, religion at its core is not about our beliefs. Real religion is about what we do with our beliefs. Our faith calls us to act. Our faith calls us to act. So here are a couple of things you can do. You can write, email, or call your congressman and senator and let them know that you oppose repealing the 2008 law that grants asylum to children fleeing violence, if you do oppose it. You can write, email, or call President Obama and tell him that you oppose fast-track deportation hearings for children. if you do oppose it. When you hear someone talking about the crisis on our border, around the water cooler, on Facebook, across a dinner table, change the narrative with the question, we are 320 million people with $17 trillion. How are 57,000 children in need of crisis? That sounds like an opportunity to live out our values as a compassionate nation. We can change the narrative. And finally, we can join with others. We can partner where we can. All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, which is another UU congregation in Indianapolis, they already have a group that has a relationship with IndyCAN, which is the Indianapolis Congressional Action Network. Indianapolis Congregational Action Network. That's hard for me to say. Anyway, this is a grassroots organization that works with religious institutions and low and moderate income communities, and its goal is to train leaders and empower people so that they can advocate for themselves. They can identify the solutions that they need and they can make it happen. And they work very deeply with immigrant communities. And UUI has reached out to All Souls and said, you're already doing this work, we would like to partner with you. And All Souls has said, terrific, we would love to have you on board. Please do join us. And other area UU churches I know have reached out to All Souls. So this is another opportunity for Central Indian Jews to get together and be stronger collectively than we are individually. And if you're interested in this work, talk to me, or you can watch the UUI website, the Facebook page, the e-blast. Information will be going out on when this group will meet again and how to get there and where it will be. And I know that they would love to have all of our passion and energy on board. Finally, the last thing that I want to close with is we heard about our Universalist tradition that undergirds this work. Let us also remember our humanist tradition that sees in every child, not a problem or threat or crisis or a gaping need to be filled, but sees in every child the promise of the human mind and the promise of the human spirit. That is our humanist tradition. One of these children could be the next Einstein, the next Shakespeare, the next Buddha, the next Sojourner Truth. All of these children will bring their own special light into the world if given a chance to shine. We are religious people who believe that miracles happen when you liberate the human spirit. These children are not a threat, they are not a crisis, they are an unopened gift. They are the promise of the future, they are a hope for tomorrow. So let us do right by them today. Let us build a land worthy of them. And let us be grateful, deeply grateful for this opportunity to be the hands of love reaching out into the world. Would you please rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn number 121, We'll Build a Land.